and welcome to our panel. We are your panel facilitators. My name is McKenna.
And I'm Daniel.
And we are your domestic violence team here at Stand Up Placer. We are a Placer County nonprofit whose mission is to save lives by empowering survivors and educating communities to stand up to domestic violence, sexual assault, and human trafficking. It is Stand Up Placer's goal this evening through this panel to answer your questions surrounding domestic violence and to provide you with an insight about different groups in the community supporting survivors and making an effort to end domestic violence.
Because of the topics discussed, we do want to provide a trigger warning for attendees that there will be conversations surrounding domestic and sexual abuse.
And we'd also like to begin this webinar with a land acknowledgement. We know that Stand Up Placer occupies a place in this community that is also territory to the Nisenan Southern Maidu people. And so we would like to honor the people, the elders, and the ancestors who continue to live on this land despite being forcibly removed from it. For this sake and for the sake of their natural systems and inhabitants, we aim to respect this land as we are humble visitors. We recognize in this acknowledgement is only the first step in honoring the land that we share. It is a call towards further learning and action, not in place of authentic relationships with the local Indigenous communities, but rather in assisting to amplify their voices. And you can learn more about the native land that we occupy at nativeland.ca.
Awesome. Thank you, McKenna. So tonight, we hope to have a conversation with you, the community, about the acts of violence that are all too often kept hidden. Domestic violence affects everyone. We are seeing high numbers of domestic violence within our community, and it is time to come together and stand up against domestic violence. Tonight's discussion with our panelists will be a question and answer style format. So you may submit questions down at the bottom by clicking on the Q&A button or into the chat. And our moderators behind the scenes, as well as us as facilitators, will present those questions to the panelists for answering.
So tonight is about education, awareness, and coming together as a community.
So without further ado, let's get started and have our panelists introduce themselves. If you would, please give your name, if you are with an agency, and a brief description about either you or the agency that you work with. Jenny, would you like to get us started?
Sure. Hello, everybody. My name is Jenny Davidson. I am the CEO and Executive Director of Stand Up Placer, and just really looking forward to tonight's discussion.
Wonderful. Thank you. Detective Grove.
My name is Alana Grove. I am a police officer currently assigned to investigations. So my current role is a detective at Roseville Police Department. Our investigation roles are a maximum of 5 years. So I'm a police officer assigned to investigations to investigate things like sexual assault and domestic violence specifically.
Thank you. Tamara and Gina.
I'm Tamara Mussolino. I'm a senior victim advocate here with the Placer County District Attorney's Victim Services.
I am Gina Nargi. I am a senior deputy district attorney assigned to the Family Protection Unit for the District Attorney's Office, and our unit handles domestic violence, sexual assault, human trafficking, as well as elder abuse cases.
Thank you. Katie.
Hi, my name's Katie, and I am a survivor of domestic violence that sought help through Stand Up Placer.
Wonderful, and thank you all so much for being here. And with that, we'd love to get started with the first question. And the first question, we do want to open up to all of you or anyone who'd like to answer, and really start with maybe dispelling some myths and potentially also giving a definition of what is domestic violence. You know, that's why we're here tonight. And so I think it's great to define that, especially in our different roles in different agencies, because, you know, the definitions can be different. And so maybe if we want to start with Stand Up Placer on our side and how we define domestic violence or intimate partner violence.
Absolutely. So I'll save the legal definitions for our legal folks. And we're really looking at when one person has used power and control over another person. And so there's a lot of ways that happens. It can be physical violence, but we don't wait for it to be physical violence before we step in and want to assist folks. What we see is like 99% of cases have financial abuse as one of the things, and they may be controlling finances to, you know, like you can't have your antibiotics or you can't have your medication, we can't afford that and you don't get it, or, you know, things like that, or emotional abuse, intimidation. So there are a lot of methods used, but it really boils down to using power and control to control somebody else. And there's a lot of other dynamics too, get me alone sometime and I'll fill your head with more than you wanted to know, but let's get to the other folks.
That's great, thank you. Maybe Detective Grove or Gina, would you like to talk about the legal or the criminal definition when we think about domestic violence?
Alana, you want to start? Or I can go. Would you like me to? So basically, domestic violence is, for us, is much more legally defined. So what we're looking at is physical abuse, emotional abuse, and sexual abuse. From a criminal standpoint, obviously, we're looking a lot at the physical side and any sexual abuse that has gone with it. But the emotional abuse is absolutely factored into our cases, because what we see a lot of times is escalation. And so it's between family members. So that could be a parent with a child, it could be spouses, a dating partner. That's generally a broad brushstroke.
Great, thank you. Detective Grove, did you want to add anything to that?
I think she pretty much covered it.
Great, thank you. Well, let's move on to the next question then, and really, again, starting with kind of what domestic violence is and going to, well, what do we do then to offer or help support survivors of domestic violence in our different roles here in the community? And so kind of going back to us at Stand Up Placer, what are some of the services that we offer for survivors of domestic violence?
Yes, so I should have mentioned, I'm glad that Gina did mention it, is so the intimate partner relationship is a huge part for us as well. And that's, it can be dating, maybe, what we think of as intimacy may not have happened, right? But it's still like it's a dating relationship or marriage or some kind of a intimate relationship. And when we hear from folks, a lot of times it's through our crisis line. I feel like we should say our crisis line frequently tonight and maybe even have it in the chat, but it's 800-575-5352. And a lot of times folks reach out to us that way and just get like that immediate support. Right now I'm in crisis. And then we have service offices in Roseville and Auburn. We have the county's confidential safe house in an undisclosed location where folks can go while they're waiting for, sometimes it's looking for the perpetrator or the waiting for a restraining order to be in place or custody orders or things like that. And so they have just a safe place to land for up to 90 days. And then we have a housing program that's 12 to 24 months where folks can really get back up on their feet and have that chance to take a deep breath and find that safety and long-term kind of support so that they can get their needs met. We have a therapy program. We have an incredible legal program. We have a family law attorney and a paralegal who both are there to support folks. We have advocates who go to court with our victims. It's almost impossible to really wrap your hands around like all the different things. We have a thrift store where our survivors shop for free. And so all the needs that they may leave in the middle of the night, if you think about like your house burned down last night, what do you need? You need everything. And that's our victims as they're fleeing. They maybe got a backpack and they are, they need everything. And so they can shop at our thrift store for free and get their needs met there. We do outreach like this, but that's really a different side of our mission. But really, we just really look for what is the thing that this victim really needs in order to find safety, and is there a way that we can do that? And we're constantly looking at, are there barriers that keep people from getting the assistance, and how can we tear those barriers down? So one thing we did a couple of years ago was to make our safe house pet friendly, because 70% of perpetrators abuse pets as a way to control victims, and 50% of victims stay in a dangerous situation longer because they're afraid of what would happen to their pet. And a lot of people ask me like, how is that? Why is that a thing? Really what it is that they have been convinced that they have no value, and they've been torn down so far that they just don't even believe that what happens to them matters anymore. But once it starts happening to their pet, then they will get safe. And so that's a little synopsis of us, but we do try to make all of our services as much as we can pet friendly when it's under our control.
Thank you, Jenny. That was a great answer. And we have a great question here coming in the chat, but I want to first, actually, if I can ask a question to Katie, after talking about our services and as a survivor of domestic violence, what have you found was maybe either the most challenging or the easiest when it came to receiving services or navigating the different systems as a survivor?
So there's nothing easy about leaving, just to be honest. I think the average survivor leaves about 7 times. The easiest part, though, of all the hard parts, was once I did get that connection and once I did get the will to leave, was hooking up with Stand Up Placer, because all of a sudden I had therapy, I had support network, I had a place to live, I had help accessing services in the community that you're not aware. I didn't know to call the DA's office because I'm taking my kids. Had I taken my kids without calling the DA's office, that's kidnapping. But since I knew to call the DA's office because of Stand Up Placer, all those services were made a lot simpler in the leaving process. Without that, I don't think I would have been able to completely escape, to be honest.
Thank you, Katie, for such an honest answer.
Yeah, so we got a great question in the chat box, and they're basically just talking about how they feel that there's sometimes a focus on the rights of the perpetrator and the expense of the victim. And so how do we make sure that the victim's rights are taken seriously and that they're protected?
So I think Tamara and I can both answer this. The simple answer is you're right. It's not a perfect system, but it's getting better. So there's hope out there. We had Marcy's law that came into effect. And so the system is changing. The system is recognizing that this is a really hard process on victims and survivors and their family. So we are seeing movement in a good direction. In a criminal courtroom, you're innocent until proven guilty. So that right is always going to stay there. It's always going to remain. I think there is room for even more improvement in terms of being able to get things to trial quicker and recognizing that oftentimes perpetrators of abuse like to use the court process as another form of abuse in this relationship, dragging the children through it, delaying court proceedings. So it's not a perfect system. And with some individuals and some perpetrators, unfortunately, they will use that system to continue their abuse and their control. So Marcy's rights is a great step. And we also have people like Tamara who are working in our office, and I'll let her speak to her role because they are fierce advocates throughout the whole court process for victims' rights.
And I think as far as a victim advocate goes, making sure that Marcy's rights are addressed with the victim early on so that the court, not only the prosecutor knows what that victim wants to invoke, but also the court is made aware. And then empowering the victim to use their voice to stand up against their perpetrator in a court setting, if that's what they choose to do, by writing a victim impact statement and letting the court know what their experience was and trying to gain their control and their power back. So there are a lot of different ways along the process where we can support victims. We support them if they come to court. We support them when they address the court, and we help them navigate the criminal justice process.
One of the things that I like that when I first started my career, I didn't see as much of is we've tried to also provide a voice for the victim in the courtroom for those who in their process of healing and recovery haven't been able to reach the point where they feel comfortable standing in a courtroom, frankly, disclosing the most intimate parts of their life in front of their abuser and around other people. So our advocates like Tamara will go to court and will read statements on their behalf. And that option does exist. And I hope everyone knows that that is available if they ever need it.
Absolutely.
Great information. Thank you. I do want to remind everyone, if you have any questions, please use the Q&A feature down at the bottom there to submit some questions. And we've been talking a lot about, the criminal justice system and once that process is started, what about, as we know, unfortunately, a lot of times victims or survivors are afraid to call the police or to make a police report, or maybe they don't even want their abuser to get arrested or prosecuted. How do you handle situations like that? Maybe first go to Detective Grove on the initial investigation side, and then back over to Tamara and Gina.
So if I understand the question correctly, I mean, obviously the situation that that person happens to be in is something that is intimate, something that can come with some embarrassment at times. But obviously the encouragement is always to contact the police. If it's something that's immediately happening, 911. If it's something that you don't think is an immediate emergency, then I can give you our non-emergency line, which is 916-774-5000. But that's a decision that somebody who's in that situation is going to have to make. But definitely just contacting police and getting it reported, the sooner the better, so we can assist as fast as possible.
Maybe throwing a quick curveball because we got a question. Tamara, if you want to kind of speak on that, but also someone was asking to further elaborate on what is Marcy's Law and what that means for victims' rights.
So Marcy's Law was created as a result of a stalking victim who was murdered. Her family fought so that others wouldn't end up in the situation that she did, or that her family did, and being face to face with her perpetrator right after he had, I think, been arraigned in court. And so it was quite unsettling for that family. And so they created Marcy's Rights, which essentially is a right to have your voice heard in court, a right to restitution in criminal cases, support. So I can't think of, I mean, there's so many different things.
Advice of offers, sentencing.
Yeah.
Process.
So the way that, as an advocate, the way that our role works here in the DA's office is if a case is filed, or if we receive a criminal case, a domestic violence case, it's reviewed by the prosecutor. An advocate is assigned to that case, and they immediately reach out to a victim, and they keep that victim informed of the case status moving forward. Is the case going to be charged? Is it not going to be charged? It's not going to be charged. We want to make sure that that victim has a safety protocol in place. A huge piece of that is referring them to Stand Up Placer for all of the wonderful resources you guys provide. Safe house, help with domestic violence restraining orders, if that's something the victim wants to go through, and so on. And so we'll continue through that process, the criminal justice process, and continue those rights along the way.
This came up a little bit before, if we could touch on in terms of survivors of domestic violence. Tamara does a number of things once a case resolves to assist our survivors through staying safe after the case has been concluded. Can you speak a little bit about Safe at Home and VineLink?
So the other things that we refer to and set victims up to is there's a resource called VineLink. That is a notification system. Should someone be in custody, that they get notified, the victim gets notified should that person make bail, should that person be transferred to another agency they were sentenced. So that's VineLink. That's another resource we send to.
Safe at Home.
Safe at Home is another program that we work with, and I think you guys do the same. You guys also have that program at Stand Up Placer that is another safety feature for victims who don't want their information out there for the public. And then restitution, if there are expenses, medical expenses, relocation, those kinds of things, we can have the court address that at the end of the criminal proceedings. But another piece to that, and I know we kind of overlap with our resources, but is the California Victims of Crime compensation, which is a huge piece. And we work, with the investigators, we work with the prosecutors to make sure that we can get those applications approved with the program so that those victims have access to relocation funds, home security cameras, those types of things as well.
And just maybe a quick clarification. I do it constantly, say a name. So Safe at Home, for anybody who doesn't know what that program is, you can get a confidential address so that you have an address that you can use for things that nobody can track to where you actually live. So that boils it down to kind of a nutshell if anybody didn't know what that program was.
Thank you, Jenny.
Thank you, Tamara.
Thanks. And the Safe at Home program, as well as the California Victim Compensation, Jenny, is that something that our advocates can assist with here at Santa Plaza?
Yes.
Oh.
So yeah, we can definitely help with that. And then the original question being like, what happens if people don't want to report? All of our advocates in our service office have privileged communication with our survivors. And so what they say to us can stay between us. We will always encourage, because like clearly we work really well together and we have utmost respect for the partners on this call. We'll always encourage folks to seek more assistance through law enforcement, through the DA's office, through CPS. And there's so many really supportive community organizations that we partner with really, really well. So we'll definitely encourage that, but it is not a requirement to get assistance from us. You don't have to have a police report on file. You don't have to promise to report. You don't have to say, well, I'll get a restraining order and I'll do this, this, and this. There's not like hoops you have to jump through in order to be able to access the services that we have through our service offices. Our safe house, everybody who works in our safe house is a mandated reporter. So they will have to report things like child abuse.
Thank you, Jenny. We had one question come in a little earlier. Someone whose family member might be experiencing domestic violence, who maybe doesn't recognize that they might be in that situation. What advice would maybe you give to someone who has a family member, or they themselves are in a situation and are struggling to either acknowledge what's going on or just might be afraid to leave that situation? And maybe if Katie has a response to that, I'd love to invite her.
Yeah, so the biggest thing here in my whatever umpteen years of therapy now is for family members that you think are going through domestic violence, there's no more of a lonely place than when you're in a domestic violence relationship. You are 100% alone. So for family members, what I would encourage you is kind of radical acceptance. A lot of times family members cut you off because they can't deal with it. And if you're a family member and that's what you have to do, I get it. But if you still want to be there, maybe address it, but don't constantly address it. Just say, hey, I think this is going on. When you're ready to talk, come to me. And then just manage your expectations of this person. They're going to flake on you all the time. They're not going to call you back. They may not be able to answer the phone. Don't leave voicemails because that will be used. It doesn't matter if you're just saying we're meeting for lunch, it'll be used against them. Manage your expectations of this person, but make yourself available. Radical acceptance, accept what they're going through, but just make yourself available because there will come a time when they're ready to go and you'll be there.
I love that, radical acceptance. Thank you, Katie.
And one other thing I would just say, also believe them. So like obviously the person who asked that question believes and really wants to get them the help that they probably need. They know that there's things going on, but I think far more often we see families who don't believe, and then the victim may not seek the next level of service because they feel like nobody's gonna believe them anyway. So number one thing I tell family members, if somebody's telling you that they're not safe or something happened, please believe them.
Also, because they go back doesn't mean it wasn't bad. Victims go back in the worst of circumstances you couldn't imagine being in. They go back, and it doesn't make sense to anybody. It doesn't have to make sense. It doesn't mean it's not bad.
Great, thank you. We had one more follow-up on the same line where, what if that victim, that survivor is potentially struggling with alcohol or substance abuse? Or maybe a better question is, what do we know about sometimes domestic violence survivors who might turn to substances or alcohol when facing abuse?
I would love to, first step is that what we see is frequently they, like, it may have started like maybe an arm was broken and they got a prescription, and then the next time they were in an abuse situation, it didn't hurt as much, and so they may end up like abusing that prescription, or they may drink or use other substances as a way to cope with the pain of what's going on in their life. And it's so highly correlated. And I don't like the word I don't think it's causational as much as correlation, but there is this high correlation, and they need more support, not less support. So please don't withdraw support from your loved ones who are using substances as a way to cope with the violence they're experiencing. They still need that radical acceptance that Katie was talking about. And it's just so often with domestic violence, we're talking about specifically tonight, but definitely with sexual assault, definitely with human trafficking. Sometimes it's coping, sometimes it's pre-existing, sometimes it's just a function of like everything is very physically painful and I'm going to use substances to numb that pain. Sometimes everything is very emotionally painful and I'm going to use substances to numb that pain. So we still need to be absolutely supportive.
Yeah, thank you, Jenny. We have another question, and this one involves restraining orders. And so the question is basically, what do you recommend for survivors to do in the event that restraining orders are violated, or if the other party breaks the restraining order? What do you suggest they do? Do you call law enforcement? Do you keep track and only call when they're extreme, or what would you guys suggest they do in that case? Detective Grove, if you'd like to answer that one, or
Alana, you want to start us off, because she's going to be right.
Yeah. So, I mean, I wouldn't try to differentiate what's extreme and what's not extreme. If the violation has occurred, then call law enforcement. You know, it's up to us to document it. If you think it could be a violation and maybe you're just not sure, I'd still call. It's not a drain of our resources. That's what law enforcement is there for. So if you have a restraining order, it's valid, and you feel that it has been violated, call law enforcement.
So the only thing I would add to that is absolutely call, and then, you know, keep track yourself, save those voicemails, save those text messages. You know, as I said, the criminal justice system is not perfect. So sometimes you have to be, as tiring as it is, you have to be your own advocate. So preserving that information so it's not lost. And you may have hesitation about calling the first time. Oh, he or she will stop. They're just being emotional, or I think they're just drinking tonight. And so we can tend to make excuses for the violations, even though they're clear violations of the order and our boundaries. So report, and keep track of everything.
And it's also, I think, a piece of getting your power back too, right? By making that report, you're sending a clear signal that, you know what, you're not going to play that game anymore. You're not going to be a part of that world anymore. So.
Thank you. Another question here, kind of in a similar vein, regarding if the person is if the victim is moving to another state or leaving the area when it comes to reporting, or even maybe restraining orders. What is the enforceability of restraining orders in other states? Maybe we'll start with that question.
So we've had this issue come up before. If the perpetrator is still in California or in Placer County, obviously that's something that we would still have jurisdiction over. So I think in those situations, 2 reports is better than 1. The first phone call, especially if they feel that there's any threats going on, should be 911 to their local law enforcement agency, because obviously if Alana is in Roseville and we have someone in Texas, she's not gonna be able to get to Texas in time. So start first with local law enforcement. I would encourage survivors, get a copy of your restraining order before you go. Have multiple copies. This way, in the moving or anything else, or if you're in a stressful situation, keep one in your car, one folded up, behind your phone case. Have one with you. And particularly if you're moving, have that ready and handy. It'll make law enforcement, it'll make life easier for local law enforcement out of the area to be able to verify the order quickly.
Or take a picture of it and put it, on your phone so you have it with you, or send it to you in an email so you can always pull it up in the event you need it.
Great, thank you for the great answer. And just a quick note, as you said something, Gina, just as we're in different agencies or different systems that we work, we also have different names for different things sometimes. And so here at Santa Placer, we often refer to our clients as survivors. Of course, in the criminal justice system or in law enforcement, they often use victim. It is the same thing. It's just a different verbiage that we use.
And I apologize. And I go back and forth. It's just, yes. I would say one other thing. If you decide to leave California and go out of state, or even if you go somewhere different in California, Jenny, you can speak to this too. Connect with Stand Up Placer before you go. They have an amazing network of people. They can figure out who in Ontario is, will be there to provide you services. Jenny and Stand Up Placer, and you guys know, you can call Texas, Minnesota. And so this way you have a support system in place when you go to leave. And then if it's necessary and you need to, then you can potentially start working on getting a restraining order in your state. Jenny, I'm sure you can speak to some of that too, but I would encourage you, if it's not Stand Up Placer, then find that local agency. And when in doubt, if you have any questions, call a police department, non-emergency line. They'll tell you who they're connected to, or the local district attorney's office. Ask for the victim advocate unit. There are so many people committed to this mission that if you were to call and say, I'm new to the area, I don't know, someone's going to give you an answer. Someone's going to give you a phone number. And everybody's here to help.
And I'll say our crisis line one more time, because, or probably more, but because we frequently get calls from out of state, whether it's somebody who they just moved here, or they've moved from here, or they just have a relative here and they want to know more about our services. We answer all of those questions, and we can frequently look up the agency in that local jurisdiction if you need that. And so again, our crisis line number is 1-800-575-5352. And if anybody is in that situation, do reach out. And if you're like, I'm not sure if this is domestic violence, reach out, because we would love to have that phone call and be able to be that support for you.
Yeah, thank you, Jenny. We really appreciate you. And that crisis line is in the chat box. And we will continue to say it throughout the night. So another question we did get is, can you explain how a victim keeps getting sucked back into the relationship? And families often ask, why don't they just leave? Kind of what myths go behind that, kind of what is behind that. And I mean, we can even touch on the LGBTQ plus community and different communities that may be affected by domestic violence.
Absolutely. So I would say all marginalized people are disproportionately impacted in a very negative way, whether it's the difficulty in reporting or even the protection of their marginalized group, and wanting to not shed any kind of negative, what they feel like is maybe negative attention toward that, which is really, really hard. And so, or not believing people will care if they reach out. So I would say it's much more difficult for all people who are in marginalized populations. So, you asked specifically about LGBT, I would say probably all, and that goes for other groups too, people who are disabled, people who are older, people who are younger, right? So all of those extremes makes it really, really difficult. And now I don't remember the original question. What was?
So the original question was basically, can you explain how survivors may continue to go back, or why they would continue to go back. And why people often ask, why don't you just leave?
Exactly. So there's so much more that goes into that. So for one thing, this is somebody who you met, fell in love with, you've promised your life to them. There could be kids in the situation, and you're wondering, like, what's worse for the kids? Like right now I'm home and I'm protecting them, but what happens if the perpetrator gets 50-50 custody? Then who's protecting them during that 50% of the time when they're there? Or they may think, well, like, I can't afford to just up and leave my home. I don't have the resources for that. I don't know. I don't have somewhere to stay. My family is already upset at me because of the back and forth. And so at this point, what am I supposed to do? I don't have people who can help me financially. A lot of times the abuser has prevented them from getting an education or work history. And so they really just don't have the resources, you know, so that's why we are really proud to stand in that gap. And Cal VCB is like so amazing with that as well, is like looking for ways that we can support them through the process so they can get safe and they can get free, and all of those resources are there. So in the moment, if you don't know about Stand Up Placer and you don't know about the Victims of Crime Board, you don't know that there's victim compensation to help you to relocate, or Stand Up Placer can help you relocate, that is very overwhelming. You know, like if I thought about, oh, I have to move in a week, like right now I'd be like, nope. And so it's terrifying. There's so much more to it than anybody assumes when you just look at, is it just, you know, like this one easy question, do I want the violence to stop? 100% of them would say, I want the violence to stop. Probably a lot don't want something terrible to happen, you know, what they consider terrible to happen to their abuser, because they fell in love with this person and they still are protective of them. And so there's that side too, and it's so complicated, and there's no way to just easily put it out there that this is it's a cut and dry easy question that people have to go through. It's just so many layers of hard.
So true.
But I'd love if Katie has other input, because she's really the knowledgeable one in this situation.
I think that the reason it's so hard to say why you stay, because when I look back, I can obviously see I was being abused. But when you're in the thick of it, I did call Stand Up Placer and asked if it was domestic violence. And what I'm asking is, I was kicked down a staircase. All my money was stolen. You know, I could go on and on all the things that happened, but I wanted to know, is this wrong, or is this just what marriage is? Because a lot of us come from a place of domestic violence. So it feels like this is just my life. Money. I had 3 kids. Daycare is $2,200 a month. I was bringing home $2,500 a month. How do you make ends meet? You guys do the math. Protecting my kids, afraid of the court system. I mean, it's such a grandiose problem. And that question, people I think always expect like an answer, like, oh, I was stupid. But no, it's such a big ask that unless you're really prepared for the answer, don't ask it, because there's not a good answer. It's so convoluted and emotional and financial and religious and cultural. I come from a cultural place. In the religion I was raised in, you don't get a divorce, period. That's the end of the sentence. There's nothing after that. And so to be the first in my family of 36 cousins to get a divorce, I mean, that takes a lot. So there's just so many things that I would encourage people to not ask that question. Maybe ask why we make it acceptable for people to kind of stay in this relationship. But that it's just such a big ask, and there's no good answer.
And I think the more important question is, why are abusers abusing? It's way more important of a question. Why, you know, will they please stop, instead of asking the victim why they haven't left yet?
Great point. Thank you. So we're hearing a lot about how, you know, big of a problem this is, yet, and we have a question in the chat around this, when it comes to the visibility of domestic violence, and how come we don't often hear about, you know, domestic violence happening very often. You know, do we know if there's a cause to that, or why it's often kind of in the shadows? That can be a question to anyone.
I can take the first portion of it. I think domestic violence is a unique crime in that the victim is ashamed. Sexual assault and domestic violence are the two crimes. If my home is robbed, I get front page news. I was robbed. I'm a victim of a crime. But if my body is robbed, what were you wearing? What did you say? Why did you go back? So in domestic violence, there's a lot of victim blaming. There's also a lot of going back. So I know when I was in my relationship, I didn't want to tell people what was going on the inside because I knew I wasn't going to leave. I mean, I did. I knew on the inside, this isn't the end. And so when I kept thinking it was the end, I would tell people, and then I go back, and then you're embarrassed. And so you keep it quiet. I think the third thing is you do see it. You just don't want to see it. You hear your neighbors screaming at each other. You hear the children screaming. I mean, I was a waitress through before I was married, and you know, I had a husband ordering a wife to not get the steak she wanted. She was getting a salad. You know, and that right there, he's telling her what she should order. You see it everywhere. You just don't want to see it.
Thank you, Katie, for an honest answer. What oh, go ahead. No, it's up. Please add if you had something.
I was just gonna basically support Katie in what she said. These are crimes that happen in secret, and oftentimes either children are nonverbal and maybe aren't old enough to understand what's going on, and by the time they are old enough, they've been raised in an environment where they're worried about mom or they're worried about dad. And so they don't want to talk about what's happening in the home. So first, you know, kind of breaking that barrier of silence. We find oftentimes that family members know what's going on, but they don't want to report necessarily because their son or daughter has asked them, please do not do this. I love him. Think about your grandkids. So there can be a lot of pressure put on families who want to stand up and do the right thing, but are persuaded to stay silent. And so it isn't until we start having either the survivors or their family members start reaching out for help that then law enforcement starts to see the problem. And neighbors may reach the point where they call, but neighbors don't want to get involved either. So I love what Katie said. People know. It's just a very difficult thing in what goes on in a relationship or in a family. I think we kind of have, Jenny, maybe you agree or disagree, but people tend to want to stay out of other people's business.
Yeah, I think that's true. But I'm hoping that conversations like this take away that stigma and the shame and allow people to be able to stand up and say, this happened to me and I deserve to be safe and healthy and to lead a life of self-determination. So hard when they've been beaten down for so long to be able to even see their own value. And so it's hard to speak up. But hopefully what we get from situations like today where we can talk about it is that if there are any victims on the call right now who are listening in, who wonder if people would believe them, that they're hearing from a group of people who do.
Thank you, Jenny. And we have another question about the restraining order side of things. And so basically the question is asking, they stated that they filed a restraining order and somebody filed the opposite party filed a restraining order against them. Does that happen often? Does that retaliation of filing another restraining order against the party happen often? I don't know if Detective Grove or Gina or even Jenny could answer that. Does that happen often, or is that something that we don't see?
Alana, do you want to go first on this? You probably see more of this than maybe necessarily I do.
So as far as restraining orders being placed on basically both parties, I haven't seen a lot of that, but that's not to say that it doesn't happen. It does happen. And typically too, the kids are often listed on those as well. So that throws in a different aspect of it. Not all the time, but it's not to say that it doesn't ever happen.
And our family law attorney is one of the attendees on here. So I'm like, gosh, I wish he was here. But Daniel is really also another expert at this question. So I really feel like I need to defer over to Daniel because he does so much of this exact work. And I feel like it definitely happens because we'll get two parties coming to us and we'll say, I'm sorry, but for whatever reason, we can't serve you and we can't say why. But Daniel is the pro. We've definitely had to like establish even policies of how we decide who we help.
Yeah, thank you, Jenny. And this question specifically was actually about, it sounds like the person who was harming their roommate then filed a civil harassment restraining order against the survivor, as a specific form of retaliation. So not even, both parties filing together, but, and we do see that where a family member or other people will then file restraining orders or false CPS reports or false, police reports against the survivor as a way to retaliate against the victim. And so it definitely does happen. And the best advice I could give is to reach out to us, give us a call, and we can connect you to our family law attorney here to qualified individuals for a free consultation about their rights when it comes to the civil court process. All right. We ran out of questions. Well, we are actually wrapping up, getting close here. Our panel was just going to be till 7 o'clock, so maybe I'll jump into one of our last questions here, and if more come up, definitely we can answer them. Actually, I'm seeing one right now as I speak. Is talking about what are the different types of restraining orders, and maybe quickly if we could elaborate on what those mean and who qualifies for which ones.
So I can't speak completely to all the different civil restraining orders out there, but there are the domestic violence restraining orders that Stand Up Plaster can assist you with, and those still have the same force and effect as a criminal restraining order. So I don't want anybody to think that just because you got a civil domestic violence restraining order that if they break it, it doesn't mean they're not committing a crime. It does. So that's an avenue for you. So don't be discouraged by that at all. In criminal cases, we basically have two different types of restraining orders. One that exists during the criminal case, which in certain circumstances can include your kids or a family member if they were a witness to a domestic violence incident. It's something we look at, and it's absolutely something we want input from our survivors on. Those are good questions that the attorneys, once they talk to the advocate and hopefully our survivors, that we're asking those questions. Do you feel that there's a need to have a restraining order related to the kids? And then we'll go back as lawyers and figure out how we work that out. But do not feel in any way that you can't call our office and say, you know what, my kids weren't home, but here's my concern. And let us work through that, and we will. The next type is after the case is concluded. So I am happy to say that the law has become a lot more understanding in this area, particularly in the realm of domestic violence. It's great, and sexual assault. I'm really excited. So what we see is that we get, in the majority of cases, up to 10 years for a criminal restraining order after the case is concluded. And if you have any further questions, I can try to answer them, but it gets kind of complicated. But what I can tell you is I'm very supportive of how the legislature has really understood some of these areas that needed to be addressed in the area of domestic violence and sexual assault.
Can I ask a question?
Go for it. Let's see if I can try.
So see a lot of times a question, I'm not saying what I think is happening, but just a question throughout there. Say victim perpetrator live in different counties. One's Sac County, one's Placer County, right? Because it's so close.
That never happens.
And like if there's CPS involved, right? And there's like all these different agencies that then become involved. How do you, as like the DA's office, victim advocates, law enforcement, how do you make sure that you're working together with, with each other, with CPS, to really help that victim and the kids to all be safe when it's like, this person may have a criminal protective order in this county, but then even the perpetrator moved to a different county, and like who's supervising that? And so there's all these like very complicated cases that we frequently see. And I would love to hear you guys speak out about how you're able to work with each other or not. What are the limitations or what's going well?
So you threw a big one at me. So generally speaking, I will say for a lot of people, we have, our perpetrators of abuse living in Placer County, the children living in Placer County, and then the survivors of abuse living in Placer County. If CPS is involved, we have a great working relationship with County Council and Child Protective Services. We're able to talk to and communicate, and we do regularly on a lot of cases, get updates on where things are standing in the dependency case. So we're very well connected, particularly if we can get the children in these situations through our Placer Multidisciplinary Interview Center. Sometimes it's called MDIC, and that's where kids will also get linked up with services. If we run into a situation where everyone started here and then people are moving, or maybe they were separated, I know I have had tremendous luck for the 8.5 years I've been in this office that I've been able to pick up the phone and call and say, I think this got transferred to Sacramento. Can you guys help me out and figure out who the social worker down there? What's their contact information? I feel like we have particularly 2 counties that are really great at working with each other. And Sacramento DA's office is also a huge resource, and us to them in terms of information sharing. That goes on regularly too. So let's say last week he was arrested for violating the restraining order in Sac, and then this week he's arrested for violating the restraining order in Placer, and he's on felony probation in Sacramento. So there's a lot of good communication between all of our community partners at the law enforcement level and our community resource partners.
There is one piece that I just wanted to add to restraining orders, and this is for victims that aren't quite ready to leave, but know they're eventually going to. Write a list of everything going on, because you're going to forget, and you have to articulate it in your restraining order or you'll get denied. Not because they want to deny your restraining order, but because it's not articulated clearly. And when you're in trauma, you don't remember that on March 27th, he threw the cat in the washing machine. You're not going to remember. You think you will, but you won't. So find somebody's house and keep a list and leave it at that house, or leave it somewhere. Hide it in the tire of your spare tire of your car, but keep a list with dates and times of everything he did. And if you're somebody that has somebody that is in a violent relationship and they're not ready to leave, keep the list yourself quietly, because they need that information to leave.
Thank you, Katie. As we wrap up here, I'd love to just kind of close with one broad question that each person can answer, within their discipline or their experience. And, we have a lot of community members here tonight, and thank you so much for attending. What can people do, in our community to either support survivors or raise awareness, right? Is it to speak out, to donate, to volunteer, maybe a little bit of all of the above? But what would you say that people can do to help?
I don't mind starting. So I would say, like, our number one thing is please believe. Please believe. Number one, believe. And then, of course, if this is something that you're finding yourself passionate about and you're like, I want to be part of this, obviously donations, we always are needing donations. And you can do that right on our website. So standupplaster.org. Volunteering, and we have different levels of volunteering. Do you want to volunteer and work with victims. And if so, there's a very long, I don't want to scare anybody, but it's 72-hour training that you have to go through. And that's a state mandated training that we can provide, but that is required in order to work with our survivors. And then other ways of volunteering too. Volunteer to help at an event, volunteer to help in our thrift store. I will be in big trouble if I don't mention volunteering with our thrift store. That's a huge, huge need. And it's so much fun. I do it. And it's just a blast to get in there and play register and, all of that. So it's a good time. It's a good family time. If you have a group of friends and you're like, we want to do something that really impacts our community, name a day that, like, the first Tuesday of every month, we're going to come volunteer, or the second Saturday, or whatever that is for you. The thrift store is an excellent opportunity for that kind of thing. So there's a lot of different ways that you can step in. The number one thing I'm going to beg for is please believe the victims or survivors in your life who tell you that they need help.
Thank you, Jenny. Any other
I just want to remind everybody, in October, it's Domestic Violence Awareness Month. So that's a really good place to get more information about domestic violence and participating. So look for things within our community. I know we all do things in our community to help bring awareness. So I think educating people through that month is going to be huge, and continue that throughout the year.
Great.
I would just, Jenny said it perfectly. I would just say also, if if it's your family member or a loved one or friend who's had the courage to come forward and report, and there is a case pending, just be there and support them. It could be a really hard road. And so if they've had the courage to come forward, support them in that journey.
And believe them.
Yes.
Thank you. Katie or Alana, would you like to add anything?
I think, like I said earlier, kind of radical acceptance, and do your best not to shut out somebody experiencing domestic violence. I get it if you have to, because sometimes for your own health, you do have to exit. There's a lot that comes with it, but leaving that door open, I think, is something that is pivotal. And if you see it, don't be afraid to address it. It is your business. Domestic violence is something that can be eradicated. It doesn't have to be here. It's not innate. It is taught. And it takes 3 generations, I think, in studies to eliminate toxicity from a family. So we can eliminate it. Stop accepting the behavior. If you're a man, and my experience is man on woman violence, and I know there's all sorts. So if you are a person who is part of this culture, call your friends out if they are violating, if they're being violent individuals, if they are perpetrators. You see it, tell them. Don't be afraid. That's how we get rid of it.
Thank you, Katie. Alana, did you have a last remark there?
I was just going to say kind of what Gina said, is just support and then also report. So that's 2 things that I would say are the biggest takeaways.
Support and report. I love it. Well, that is our discussion tonight. I want to give a huge thank you to all of our panelists for joining us this evening, especially on a fairly short notice that we put this together on. So thank you so much, and thank you everyone who attended and participated and asked questions. And if you have any further questions, we've been putting our phone number and our website in the chat all night. So please feel free to reach out to us if you need any support or assistance, or just have any questions. And with that, everyone, please have a great rest of your night.